DBSCAN taught us how to group points by density, but some datasets are simply too wide to navigate. To handle them, we have to shrink the dimensions themselves before we can even begin to sort the information inside. This brings us to algorithm number 21, Principal Component Analysis, or PCA. It sits right at the heart of the clustering and dimensionality family. Modern datasets are incredibly wide. You might have a spreadsheet with tens of thousands of rows, but also hundreds of different columns. The difficulty lies in figuring out which handful of those columns actually carry the signal you need. Most raw data is bloated. Think about tracking height and shoe size, or the color values of two pixels right next to each other in an image. They move together, carrying the exact same underlying information, just duplicated across multiple columns. Carrying around all those redundant dimensions has a physical cost. It chokes up your computer's memory, makes downstream machine learning models overfit to noise, and strips away our ability to visualize the data, since human brains tap out after 3 dimensions. You can't just close your eyes and delete half the spreadsheet to save space. If you blindly drop columns, you are guaranteed to delete hidden, valuable signals along with the noise. We need a way to combine the data, to take hundreds of correlated features and compress them down into a tiny set of entirely new dimensions, keeping the true shape of the data intact. To compress these dimensions safely, PCA operates on one incredibly strict rule: variance is equal to information. If a feature across your dataset barely fluctuates, say everyone in your customer database is exactly the same age, that column tells your model absolutely nothing useful. But if a feature spreads out widely, it holds the signal. The true structure of a dataset lives exactly where it spreads out the most. This idea goes back to 1901, when mathematician Carl Pearson posed a purely geometric challenge. If you have a scattered cloud of points floating in space, how do you find the single straight line that best cuts through their center? He was trying to solve a 3D physical puzzle, but the math he used to find that line of closest fit is the exact same framework we use to cure n-dimensional data bloat. PCA centers the data cloud and rotates the axes, aligning the new axis with the greatest spread. The orange arrow, Principal Component 1, shoots through the longest variance. The violet arrow, Component 2, captures the next greatest variance, remaining perfectly perpendicular. Because this process relies purely on geometry, it is unsupervised. It doesn't look at data labels or categories. It is also strictly linear, meaning it only builds straight lines through the data. This scatter plot proves the concept on a noisy distribution of numbers. The dominant black arrow maps the primary direction of the data, while the shorter arrow captures the remaining perpendicular spread. We can run this exact mathematical concept on a physical shape to see how it operates. When mapping the principal axes onto this fish silhouette, the longest line runs exactly nose to tail. The secondary axis cuts straight across the body. Dimensionality reduction represents the literal, physical act of finding the true shape of the data and rotating our perspective to match it. To turn this geometry into a programmatic pipeline, we start by taking our raw data and centering it around 0. Then we calculate a covariance matrix, a grid that summarizes exactly how all the features vary together. Next, the algorithm calculates those perpendicular directions and ranks them based on exactly how much variance they capture. In almost every case, that very first principal component holds the lion's share of the dataset's variance. By keeping just the top few components, we retain nearly all the original information. We can safely collapse the data and discard the rest. But there is a catch. Look at this trade-off diagram. Because PCI is strictly linear, it completely misses curved or nonlinear structures in data. If your data twists into a spiral, PCA will just draw a straight line right through it. We can easily visualize rotating a fish or drawing arrows through a scatter plot, but geometric intuition is not an executable program. When you're staring at a wall of 1,000,000 raw numbers, how do a handful of lines of code actually compute these specific axes without a human pointing them out? Understanding the rotation is only the first half of the battle. Next, we have to look at the exact mathematical recipe used to perform it on real data. Our goal is to take a scattered cloud of measurements. The code for this implementation is available in the 50 Algorithms repository on GitHub, within the Chapter 6 notebook for unsupervised machine learning. We are using the classic iris dataset. For the computer, this is just a 4-dimensional grid, a matrix recording the sepal and petal dimensions of various flowers. But before the algorithm can run, the species column, the labels identifying the flowers, must be dropped from the script. The entire process is controlled by one primary command. We initialize the model by setting n components to 4. By requesting all 4 components, we can see the complete ranking of the data's variance before we decide how much of it to keep. Next, we run pca.fit_x. This is the moment the algorithmic engine begins its work. The script centers the dataset around its mean, then generates a covariance matrix to calculate how features vary together. It performs a singular value decomposition, calculating eigenvalues and eigenvectors to find the new perpendicular directions. That one line of code has rotated the dataset's axes, creating a new coordinate system optimized for variance. To see what the algorithm discovered, we look at the weights matrix. This shows how the script maps our original 4 features to these new dimensions. Each row is a principal component, and the numbers within are the coefficients used to blend the original measurements into a single summary. We then check the explained variance ratio. This readout tells us exactly how much information each new axis successfully captured. In this scree plot, the orange bar represents the first principal component. With over 92% of variance concentrated here, the remaining axes contribute very little. We can collapse the data onto the first 2 components with almost no loss. To project a single flower, we take its 4 raw measurements, multiply them by the PC1 weights, and sum them together into a Rystogel coordinate. By applying these weights, we have compressed a 4-dimensional reality into a high-efficiency summary while knowing exactly how much data we left behind. Beyond the syntax, the programmer's main responsibility is setting the number of components. This is the only manual control that really matters. If you keep more components, you preserve more variance, but your models become more computationally expensive and complex to manage. If you dial it down, you get a fast, compact summary, but you are forced to destroy nuance and discard the edge cases in your data. There is also a limitation in the math itself. The code is barely 4 lines long. Mastering the syntax is simple. The real skill is knowing exactly when to pull this trigger and when to keep it holstered. Clear shape of the data that remains. Take population genetics. A researcher might be staring at thousands of distinct genetic markers for a single individual. By applying PCA, they can project those thousands of markers down to just 2 principal axes on a flat screen, revealing distinct ancestral clusters. Look at this silhouette. The 2 intersecting red lines represent the primary axes of length and height. The algorithm finds the physical structure by aligning with the greatest spread of pixels. All minor deviations outside those axes are categorized as noise and removed. It acts as a ruthless editor. You trade the minor surface details for major structural clarity, drastically reducing the size of the file for faster storage and transmission. This editing process is exactly why PCA is so crucial in the backend of machine learning architectures. Raw data is often too bulky and redundant to feed directly into a neural network. This flowchart breaks down the standard production pipeline. Instead of feeding a downstream model 500 raw, overlapping features, you feed it 20 highly condensed, decorrelated components. The model runs faster, and because the noise is gone, it is much less likely to overfit to bad data. In a production environment, PCA functions as an efficiency engine. However, treating PCA as a universal fix will ruin your models if you ignore its 4 distinct blind spots. First, it only understands straight lines. If your data has a curved structure, like a spiral or a half-moon distribution, PCA will flatten it out, crushing the data into a meaningless jumble. Second is interpretability. Because principal components are abstract mathematical blends of your original features, you cannot easily explain to a human stakeholder exactly which input drove a specific decision. Third, it is highly sensitive to scale. If you measure one feature in millimeters and another in miles without standardizing the units first, the larger variable will artificially hijack the entire model. And fourth, the most dangerous trap. Variance does not automatically equal usefulness. The specific label you are trying to predict might be hiding in the exact low variance data that PCA just decided to throw away. Relying purely on variance as a proxy for what matters is a vulnerability. It requires constant human oversight to ensure the actual signal isn't lost in the compression. Looking at this dashboard of the top algorithms, principal component analysis sits firmly as algorithm 21, establishing itself as a foundational leader in the unsupervised learning and dimensionality reduction category. This structural breakdown is based on 50 algorithms every programmer should know by Imran Ahmed, published by PACT. Rotate onto what varies. Keep what matters. Let the rest go. PCA forces you to make a calculated, strategic choice. You trade a small sliver of information to gain a massive amount of clarity.